"She shouldn't be here," my daughter-in-law whispered, laughing. They sat me far from the table at Christmas dinner. They ignored my food and passed the dishes right over me. My son pretended not to see while everyone ate in silence. But that night, they made a mistake they'd never forget. My name is Margaret Ann Foster. I'm 72 years old, and I'm the mother of David, who's 45. For you to better understand this true story, I'll tell you how it all began. You know that feeling when you shouldn't be somewhere? Well, that's exactly what I felt when I walked through my son's door that Christmas night. I was carrying a simple apple pie, the kind I always made when he was a child, and I wore a wool coat that was a good few years old, but I kept it spotless. The house was lit up, full of expensive decorations and that smell of sophisticated food that I couldn't even pronounce properly. But the moment I stepped into the living room, I felt all eyes turning to me, and it wasn't the kind of look you get when someone's happy to see you. It was different, like I'd invaded a place where I wasn't welcome, where my presence was a nuisance. Before I could even greet my son properly, I heard Jennifer's voice, my daughter-in-law, cutting through the air like a sharp knife. She was standing next to a friend, whispering, but loud enough for me to hear perfectly. "People like that only show up when they need something, don't you think?" They both laughed quietly, exchanging that knowing look that says everything without needing words. I felt my heart tighten, but I kept the smile on my face. That smile I'd learned to use as a shield over the years. My son David was on the other side of the room, talking with some guests, and when our eyes met for a second, he quickly looked away, as if he hadn't seen anything, as if I wasn't standing there holding that pie made with so much care. They pointed me to a place to sit, but it wasn't at the main table where everyone was already seated. It was an improvised little corner, almost hidden, with a chair that seemed to have been grabbed at the last minute and placed there just because I'd shown up. I stood there for a few seconds, processing it, trying to understand if this was really what was happening or if I was overreacting. But no, it was real as the humiliation that was starting to burn my face. I sat down slowly, placing the pie on the edge of that makeshift little table, and watched the scene in front of me. The main table was beautiful, full of expensive dishes, crystal glasses, and everyone laughing and talking as if I didn't exist there, just a few yards away. When I tried to offer the pie I'd brought, carefully lifting the platter and approaching the table, Jennifer looked at me with that fake smile that only a gold-digger daughter-in-law knows how to make. "Oh, how cute! You brought something homemade," she said. But the tone was mocking, not grateful. "But you know how it is. Homemade food doesn't really go with the dinner we prepared here today. Everything's so sophisticated." She said that last word looking at the other guests, and some laughed quietly, trying to hide it. But I heard every little chuckle, felt every judgmental look. I went back to my corner with the pie still in my hand, and I realized that nobody was going to want to taste it, not because it wasn't good, but because it came from me, from the elderly mother they clearly didn't want there. The dishes started circulating around the table, one after another, each one more elaborate than the last. They passed by me as if I were invisible, as if my improvised spot wasn't part of that dinner. Nobody offered me anything. Nobody asked if I wanted to serve myself something. I just sat there, watching everyone eat, talk, laugh, while my stomach rumbled quietly and my heart ached loudly. At one point, a tray passed so close to me that I even reached out my hand, but the person holding it simply kept walking, as if I wasn't there. It was at that moment I understood. This wasn't just a bad night. It was a message, clear as day, that I had no value whatsoever to them. I watched my son throughout the entire dinner, waiting, hoping he'd do something, that he'd say some word in my defense, that he'd at least acknowledge the absurdity of that situation. But David kept eating, laughing at others' jokes, serving wine, acting like everything was absolutely normal. How can a son ignore his own mother like that? I asked myself that several times while I was there, but the answer never came. All that remained was that emptiness, that pain, that only those who've been treated like nothing by someone they love can understand. And the worst part was that I knew it wasn't just that night. This had been coming from before. It had been growing, and I'd let it happen. Jennifer made a point of conducting the entire dinner as if she were the absolute owner of that house and those people. She spoke loudly, laughed even louder, and kept throwing out comments about people who live in the past or people who don't keep up with evolution. I knew every phrase was directed at me, even without her mentioning my name. The other guests seemed to love it, or at least didn't care enough to say something. And my son? Well, he just smiled and agreed with his wife, like he always did. It was as if he'd forgotten where he came from, forgotten who that woman sitting in the corner was, that mother who once did everything to give him a better future. When dinner finally ended, everyone got up to go to the living room, where they'd serve coffee and dessert that Jennifer had ordered from some expensive bakery. Nobody looked back. Nobody asked if I wanted to join them. I stayed there sitting in that corner, with my untouched pie beside me, feeling the weight of that total humiliation descend on my shoulders like a heavy blanket. It was at that moment that something inside me changed, something I couldn't explain with words right then, but that I felt strongly in my chest. It wasn't anger, it wasn't sadness, it was something different, something that felt like a decision slowly forming, like a seed being planted. I decided to stay a few more minutes there before leaving, just watching everything from afar. I saw Jennifer distributing pieces of a super expensive French cake, saw my son laughing at some joke one of the guests told, saw everyone celebrating their perfect Christmas. And then I realized something. None of them knew who I really was. They looked at me and only saw an elderly mother, someone without importance, someone who probably depended on their goodwill to survive. But the truth was different, and they had no idea. This realization gave me a kind of silent power, and for the first time that horrible night, I genuinely smiled. I grabbed my purse and my pie and got up slowly, adjusting my old coat. I walked through the living room where everyone was, but nobody noticed my departure. Nobody said goodbye. Only Jennifer shot me a quick look, that look of someone who's happy to see an unwanted person leaving. I opened the door by myself and stepped out into the cold night, feeling the wind hit my face and dry the tears I didn't even know were falling. As I walked to my car, I thought about everything that had happened, about every word, every look, every gesture of contempt. And it was there, in that freezing parking lot, that I made a decision. They were going to find out who I really was, but not the way they expected. I drove home in silence, with the pie still on the passenger seat, and with each block that passed, my resolution became clearer. They'd tested me, humiliated me, put me in a place where they thought I should stay. But what they didn't know was that I'd chosen to be in that place. I'd chosen to seem small, insignificant, worthless. And now, after that night, I knew exactly why. Because when you want to discover who people really are, you need to remove everything they think defines you. And that's exactly what I did. When I got home, I put the pie in the fridge, took off my coat, and sat in the living room armchair. I looked around at that simple house with old but comfortable furniture and thought about everything that was stored there, about every secret I'd kept for so many years. They thought they knew me, thought they knew everything about me, but they knew nothing. And this emotional story was just beginning. Because one thing I learned throughout life, people only show who they really are when they think you have nothing to offer. And that Christmas night, my ungrateful son and my gold-digger daughter-in-law had shown exactly who they were. Have you ever stopped to think about how much appearances shape the way people treat you? Well, that's exactly what led me to make one of the most important decisions of my life. After that humiliating Christmas night, many people might think I'd always lived that way, with simple clothes and a modest life. But the truth is that it was a choice, a very well-thought-out decision I'd made years ago. I wasn't poor, never was, but I decided to seem that way. And I had a very strong reason for it, a reason that only now, after everything that happened, was starting to make complete sense. Because when you want to discover people's true character, you need to remove from the equation everything that might influence their judgment. It all started about 10 years ago, when I noticed a subtle but constant change in the behavior of people around me. I'd just sold one of my businesses and was living comfortably, with designer clothes, dinners at expensive restaurants, frequent trips. My son David still treated me with affection back then, called me every week, came to visit. But then he met Jennifer, and things started to change. At first it was imperceptible, little things here and there, but over time it became obvious. They only looked for me when they needed something, when they wanted an expensive gift, when they needed financial help. And it was at that moment that a question started hammering in my head. Do they love me, or do they love what I can offer? I decided to do an experiment, as painful as it might be. I started changing my appearance gradually, replacing designer clothes with simple pieces I bought at department stores. I stopped mentioning my investments, my properties, my financial achievements. In conversations with my son, I started complaining about bills, talking about economizing, mentioning that things were tight. It wasn't easy to do this because it meant giving up recognition, the respect that comes when people know you have money. But I needed to know the truth, needed to understand if the love my son said he felt for me was real or conditioned on what I could give him. The transformation took time, but it was complete. I put away all my expensive clothes in a locked closet, kept only the essentials, comfortable but clearly old pieces. My routine changed too. I started cooking more at home, avoiding places where I might be seen as someone with money, driving my old car instead of trading it for a new model. Here in the United States, where success is measured by what you display, by the brand of your car, by the size of your house, I was doing exactly the opposite. I was becoming invisible. I was erasing myself, and the more I erased myself, the clearer the truth became about the people around me, especially about my ungrateful son and my gold-digger daughter-in-law. At home, I kept a completely different life from the one I showed the world. My important documents stayed locked in a safe, untouched, waiting for the right moment. Bank statements, property deeds, investment receipts, everything was there, organized, protected. I knew exactly how much I had, knew I was financially secure for the rest of my life, and there'd still be enough left for future generations. But nobody knew this, nobody imagined. To everyone, including my son, I was just an elderly mother living on a modest retirement who needed to economize, who might one day need help. And it was exactly this image that allowed me to see the truth nobody wants to admit. The years went by, and my observation became sharper. I wrote everything down, every interaction, every comment, every time I was treated differently because of my humble appearance. Jennifer started making comments about my clothes, suggesting I take better care of myself, that I dress better. My son stopped inviting me to important events, saying I wouldn't feel comfortable in more sophisticated environments. On the few occasions they invited me to something, it was clear my presence was tolerated, not desired. And with each of these situations, I wrote it down, recorded it, kept it not only in memory, but in small details that would one day make a difference. There were moments when I almost gave up this experiment. Moments when the pain was so great that I just wanted to reveal everything and end that farce. Especially when I saw my son looking at me with that mix of pity and embarrassment, as if I were a burden he had to carry. But something inside me insisted on continuing, insisted on seeing how far this would go. Because deep down, I needed to be absolutely sure before making any drastic decision. I needed to eliminate any possibility of being wrong, of misjudging their intentions. And so I continued day after day, living that simple life while keeping the truth about who I really was. The anonymity gave me a strange freedom I'd never experienced before. When you have money and people know it, every interaction is contaminated by interest, by expectation, by calculation. But when you seem to have nothing, the masks fall, the true intentions appear. I saw this not just with my son and Jennifer, but with other people too. Neighbors who used to be friendly became distant. Acquaintances who'd call me for lunch stopped calling. It was as if I'd stopped existing on their social radar, and this invisibility showed me exactly who was worth keeping around and who was there only for what I represented. Jennifer became increasingly open about her contempt for me. On one occasion, during a visit, she commented to a friend, right in front of me, that people without resources should think twice before having children, because they end up being a burden in old age. I was sitting there drinking tea, and she said this as if I weren't listening, or worse, as if I didn't care. My son was in the next room and certainly heard, but he said nothing, didn't defend me, didn't put his wife in her place. He just kept doing what he was doing, as if those cruel words hadn't been directed at his own mother. That hurt more than any direct insult could hurt. I started noticing a clear pattern. The less I seemed to have, the worse the treatment. It wasn't just contempt. It was almost as if I'd become a problem to be solved. Jennifer started making suggestions about affordable nursing homes, about assistance programs for the elderly, about how I could simplify even more my life. Each suggestion came wrapped in false concern. But I saw the truth behind it. She wanted me out of the way, wanted me to stop being an inconvenient reminder of my son's humble origins. Because yes, David came from a simple family, and I worked hard to give him opportunities I never had. But now that he'd moved up in life, I'd become an embarrassment. But I stayed firm in my plan, observing, writing things down, waiting. I knew that eventually the right moment would come, the moment when all of this would make sense. Because this emotional story wasn't about revenge. It never was. It was about truth, about dignity, about understanding the real value of human relationships when you remove money from the equation. And the more time passed, the more I realized I'd made the right choice. Because if I'd continued displaying my comfortable financial situation, I would never have discovered who my son had really become, would never have seen the true face of the woman he chose as his wife. On those lonely nights at home, after awkward visits or cold phone calls, I'd sit in my favorite armchair and reflect on everything. I thought about how I'd gotten there, about all the choices I'd made, about how I'd built everything from scratch. And then I'd look at the documents stored in the safe and knew that when the time came, I'd have all the proof I needed. Not just financial proof, but proof of character, mine and theirs. And something told me that time was coming, that events were aligning in a way that soon there'd be no more pretending, not for them and not for me. The elderly mother they despised so much was about to become something completely different. You know when you realize something that was occasional has become routine? That's exactly what happened in the months following that horrible Christmas. Jennifer simply stopped disguising the cruel treatment she gave me. Before, at least there was an appearance of politeness, that kind of cold courtesy people use when they want to keep up appearances. But now it was open contempt in your face, without any attempt to hide it. Each visit I made to their house became more uncomfortable than the previous one, each phone call colder, each interaction more painful. And the worst part was that my son David simply allowed it, agreed with his silence, validated it with his omission. I'd officially become a nuisance in their lives. The visits started being treated like unwanted invasions. I remember one afternoon when I showed up without warning, something mothers do, right? I brought some cookies I'd made, the kind David loved when he was a child. I rang the doorbell and waited, hearing footsteps inside, voices whispering. Jennifer opened the door with that expression that clearly said I was interrupting something important. "Oh, you should have called first," she said, holding the door half closed, as if blocking my entry. "We're kind of busy today, you know how it is." I stood there, holding my container of cookies like an idiot, feeling the heat rising up my face. She didn't even invite me in, just took the cookies from my hand and said they'd call me later. The door closed in my face before I could respond. But the worst was yet to come. Jennifer started making increasingly direct suggestions about what I should do with my life, as if she had any right to give opinions about my choices. On one of the rare occasions they invited me for lunch, she started talking about how I should simplify my existence even more. "Look, Mom," she called me that with a tone that made the word sound like an insult. "Have you thought about selling that house of yours? It's too big for you alone, and I'm sure it's hard to maintain. With the money, you could rent a smaller apartment, more practical, and you'd still have some left over to live better." She said this while cutting her grilled salmon, without even looking me in the eyes, as if she were discussing the weather and not my entire life. My son was sitting next to her, and I waited, wished with all my strength that he'd say something, that he'd defend my autonomy, that he'd put his wife in her place. But you know what he did? He agreed. "Yeah, Mom, maybe Jennifer's right. You're getting older, and that house really is big. Something smaller would be more practical." I felt my heart sink. My ungrateful son was there, on the side of a gold-digger daughter-in-law, suggesting I get rid of my house, my home, as if it were something disposable. They didn't know, of course, that the house had been completely paid off for years, that I had other properties, that my financial situation was infinitely better than they imagined. And I wasn't going to tell them. Not yet. I just smiled and said I'd think about it. The suggestions kept getting more aggressive. Jennifer started mentioning government assistance programs, as if I needed public charity. "Did you know there are programs for low-income elderly people? They help with food, medicine, things like that. You should take a look. You might qualify." Every word was a stab, every suggestion a total humiliation disguised as concern. She did this in front of other people too, their friends, relatives, as if there was no problem publicly exposing my supposed poverty. And David? He kept quiet. Or worse, agreed, reinforced, validated every cruel comment from his wife. The breaking point came during a family gathering they organized. Everyone was there. Cousins, uncles, some close friends of the couple. We were discussing David's birthday, planning a big party, and naturally people started giving suggestions, opinions about what to do. When my turn came to speak, when I started suggesting something simple but meaningful, Jennifer interrupted me mid-sentence. With all due respect, and you know when someone starts a sentence like that there won't be any respect, I think people without financial means shouldn't give opinions about decisions involving significant expenses. We don't want you to feel pressured to contribute with something you can't afford. The silence that followed was deafening. I looked around the room, searching for some sign of discomfort, some person who thought that was absurd. But everyone looked away. Some even nodded their heads, as if Jennifer had said something perfectly reasonable. And my son? He was on his phone, pretending not to have heard, avoiding my gaze in every possible way. I tried to keep talking, tried to say that my suggestion had nothing to do with money, but with emotional meaning. But Jennifer simply started talking over me, completely ignoring my presence. It was at that moment I understood. I no longer had a voice in that family, no longer had value, no longer had a place. To them, I'd become irrelevant. I left that meeting early, making up some excuse about not feeling well. Nobody insisted I stay. Nobody offered to walk me to the car. Nobody seemed to care in the slightest. I drove home with tears running down my face, but this time, they weren't just tears of sadness. There was something more there, a mixture of pain and determination, of hurt and clarity, because every humiliation, every cruel comment, every complicit silence from my son was being filed not just in my memory, but in the growing conviction that very soon they'd discover who I really was. And when that happened, there'd be no excuses, no going back. The following weeks were more of the same, just intensified. Jennifer started treating me as if I were an inconvenient stranger, someone who showed up occasionally and needed to be tolerated out of politeness. My son kept avoiding any confrontation, any serious conversation, any moment where he'd have to choose between his wife and his mother. And me? I continued with my simple routine, with my modest clothes, with my appearance of an elderly mother without resources. But inside, something was changing. That seed that had been planted on that humiliating Christmas night was growing, getting stronger, preparing to sprout in a way nobody expected. I started documenting everything more systematically. I wrote down dates, conversations, who was present in each situation, exactly what was said. I kept cold text messages, evasive emails, records of unanswered calls. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation, because I knew that when the time came to show who I really was, I'd need more than my word. I'd need concrete proof of the treatment I received, of my son's transformation into someone I no longer recognized, of the true nature of that woman he chose to put above everything and everyone. This emotional story was far from over, and the next chapter would be even more revealing. There was a specific moment that remained etched in my mind as a watershed. David called me, something rare at that time, and for a second, my heart filled with hope. I thought maybe he'd realized how wrong things were, how I was being treated. But no. He called to ask, no, to strongly suggest that I stop showing up without warning. Mom, you need to understand that Jennifer has a routine, has commitments, and these surprise visits of yours make everything kind of messy. I tried to argue that mothers always visit their children, that I didn't think I needed to make an appointment to see my own family. But he was firm. Things have changed, Mom. You need to adapt. I hung up the phone and sat in silence for hours, processing those words. The adaptation he was asking for was, actually, an erasure. They wanted me to conveniently disappear, to exist only when useful or necessary, to be content with the crumbs of attention they decided to throw my way. And for a moment, I almost accepted that as my fate, almost convinced myself that maybe that's really how things had to be. But then I remembered everything I'd built, everything I'd kept secret, all the years of hard work and careful planning. And I realized that no, I wasn't just going to disappear. I was going to do exactly the opposite, but in my own time, in my own way, when I was ready. And something told me that moment was coming faster than I imagined. Have you ever felt invisible to the people you love most? Well, that's exactly how the following months unfolded. The isolation that was previously just cold behavior transformed into something deliberate, calculated, a silent punishment for something I didn't even know I'd done. My messages started going unanswered, not for hours, but for entire days. I'd send a good morning to my son and nothing. I'd ask how he was, if everything was okay, and the silence on the other end was deafening. At first, I tried to justify it, thought maybe he was really busy, that modern life is hectic, that people have 1,000 things to do. But deep down, I knew the truth. It wasn't about being busy. It was about deliberately ignoring me. It was about making me feel like I didn't matter anymore. The calls I made went straight to voicemail, and when David eventually returned them, it was always with a ready excuse. "Sorry, Mom. I was in an important meeting." "Oh, I left my phone on silent. I was dealing with some urgent things with Jennifer." There was always something more important than answering his own mother. I started spacing out my contact attempts, afraid of seeming desperate, afraid of being seen as that annoying elderly mother who doesn't understand that children have their own lives. But you know what hurts more? It's not the not wanting to talk to me, it's the pretending that everything's fine when he finally responded. As if all that distance was normal, acceptable, just a natural part of life. The invitations simply disappeared. Before, even with all the coldness, they still called me for some things. Birthdays, sporadic dinners, family events. But suddenly, nothing. Weeks passed, then months, without any invitation, any mention of any event. I'd find out about things by chance, through offhand comments, or worse, seeing photos on social media. That's how I found out about Jennifer's birthday. I was scrolling through my feed absent-mindedly when I saw the photos. A beautiful party, impeccable decoration, dozens of people, everyone dressed elegantly, smiling for the camera. And there was my son, next to his wife, embraced, happy. The caption said something about surrounded by the people I love most. I wasn't there. Didn't even know there was going to be a party. I felt my stomach turn when I saw those images. I zoomed in on the photos, trying to understand, trying to see if I'd misinterpreted. But no, it was exactly what it seemed. A big celebration, clearly planned in advance, and I hadn't been invited. I scrolled through the comments, saw dozens of people congratulating, several guests tagging their own photos. Everyone knew about the party. Everyone was invited, except me, the birthday boy's mother, the elderly mother who didn't deserve even a thought, even a consideration. I stayed up all night looking at those photos, each one hurting more than the last, each of their smiles seeming like a stab in my chest. How had it gotten to this point? How had my ungrateful son become someone capable of doing this to me? The next day, I gathered courage and called David. I needed to hear it from his mouth, needed an explanation, however painful it might be. He answered on the 10th ring, and his voice was clearly irritated that I was calling. "Mom, it's kind of early. What's up?" I took a deep breath and asked about the party, trying to keep my voice steady, without sounding accusatory. There was a silence on the other end, that kind of silence that says the person was caught off guard. "Oh, that. Yeah. It ended up being kind of last minute, you know? Didn't have time to tell everyone." A lie. I'd seen the decoration, the elaborate cake, the printed invitations in some guests' hands in the photos. None of that was last minute. But before I could contest it, Jennifer took the phone. I heard her voice in the background saying, "Let me talk to her," and then she was on the line, with that falsely sweet tone I already knew so well. "Look, to be honest with you, we simply forgot to tell you. It was unintentional, no need to make a drama out of it." Forgot, the word echoed in my head. How do you forget to invite your husband's mother to your own birthday? How do you forget the existence of someone who should be important in your life? But I knew it wasn't forgetfulness. It was choice. They chose to exclude me, chose to celebrate without me, chose to pretend I didn't exist. And the worst part was hearing that being minimized, treated as if I were overreacting for feeling hurt. After that episode, I noticed a disturbing pattern. My presence had become an embarrassment to them. It wasn't just that they didn't want to include me. It was that they actively avoided situations where I might appear. I found out through a distant cousin that there'd been a barbecue at their house a few weeks earlier. Just close family, according to what David had said to justify my absence when he eventually mentioned the event. But the cousin was there, uncles were there, even close friends they considered like family were there. Everyone except me. The message was clear. I was no longer considered close family, was no longer part of their inner circle, was no longer welcome. My gold-digger daughter-in-law had achieved what she wanted, to completely erase me from my son's life. Social media became a constant source of pain. Every happy photo they posted, every important moment they shared publicly, and from which I'd been excluded, every caption about gratitude for the special people in my life, everything was a cruel reminder that I was no longer part of that. I thought about blocking, about unfollowing, about sparing myself that torture. But something made me keep looking, keep documenting, keep collecting evidence of that systematic exclusion. Because deep down, I knew all of that had a purpose, that this emotional story was taking me somewhere, even if I still didn't know exactly where. There was a particularly painful occasion on Mother's Day. I woke up early, kind of hoping, even knowing it probably wouldn't happen, that maybe this year would be different. I spent the whole day checking my phone, waiting for a call, a message, anything. Nothing. The day went by, and nothing. By evening, I'd given up, had accepted that not even on Mother's Day did I deserve to be remembered. That's when I saw on Instagram, David had posted a photo with Jennifer and her mother, with a caption about strong women who inspire. My mother-in-law, whom he'd known for just a few years, had gotten a post, probably got flowers, maybe a lunch. And me? I got silence, forgetfulness, invisibility. I cried that night like I hadn't cried in years. I started questioning if the problem wasn't with me. Had I been such a bad mother? Had I done something terribly wrong that justified this treatment? I turned over memories in my head, trying to find the moment when everything went wrong, the mistake I'd made to deserve being treated like a burden. But I couldn't find it. I'd been a good mother, had sacrificed so much to give David a better life, had worked hard, had loved unconditionally. The problem wasn't what I'd done. It was what I'd become in their eyes, someone without value, without resources, without usefulness, a poor elderly mother who only served to remind them of a past they wanted to forget. But you know what's interesting about pain? It can destroy you or it can strengthen you. And after all those months of isolation, of total humiliation, of being treated as if my existence were a nuisance, something started to change inside me. The sadness was giving way to a cold clarity, almost clinical. I'd done my experiment, had lived as someone without resources, and the results were clear. My son had failed the most basic test of humanity, treating his own mother with dignity regardless of her financial situation. And my daughter-in-law had shown her true face, that of a gold digger who measured people's worth by the size of their bank accounts. I stopped trying to make contact with the same frequency. Not because I'd given up on them, but because I'd realized it was time to change strategy. I continued living my simple life, continued with my modest clothes and my discreet routine. But I started preparing for something bigger, something that was forming in my mind as a clear and inevitable plan. Because one thing I'd learned in all those months of isolation, when you're ignored, when you're invisible, you see things people don't realize you're seeing. And I'd seen a lot, more than they could imagine. And all of this was about to become very, very relevant. There are things in life we keep so well hidden that we even forget they exist, right? But I never forgot. Each document, each receipt, each bank statement was exactly where I'd left it, patiently waiting for the right moment. That Tuesday morning, after months being treated as if I didn't exist, I decided it was time to start preparing the ground for the big turnaround. I put on one of my simple outfits, grabbed my old purse, and drove downtown to a discreet building where my lawyer's office was. Robert Mitchell had been my lawyer for over 15 years, a trustworthy man who knew every detail of my financial situation, and he knew how to keep secrets as well as I did. The receptionist greeted me with a genuine smile, so different from the looks of pity or contempt I received from my own family. "He's expecting you. You can go right in." I knocked on the door and entered, feeling that strange sensation of being about to set in motion something that had no turning back. Robert stood up to greet me, shaking my hand firmly. "How are you feeling today?" He always asked that, not in the automatic way people do, but genuinely, looking me in the eyes, wanting to know. "Better," I replied. And it was true. For the first time in months, I felt I had some control over the situation, that I was no longer just a passive victim of my family's contempt. "Let's review everything then?" We sat down and he opened a thick folder, full of documents that told the story nobody knew. "Let's review everything then?" he asked. adjusting his glasses. I nodded, and then he started listing, one by one, all the assets I'd accumulated over decades of hard work and smart investments. 3 properties completely paid off in different states, 2 of which were rented, generating passive income. Diversified investment funds that had grown consistently over the years. Stocks in solid companies that paid good dividends. A robust savings account that by itself would be enough to live comfortably until the end of life. I heard all of that being listed and almost couldn't believe it was talking about me, about the elderly mother my son and daughter-in-law treated like she was destitute. Robert stopped at a specific document and looked at me with that serious expression he used when he wanted to make sure I was paying attention. You know, all of this is registered exclusively in your name, right? Nothing's in David's name, nothing's been transferred, there's no co-ownership of anything. Everything's yours, legally and unquestionably. I confirmed, yes, I knew. It had been a deliberate choice, made years ago precisely to maintain absolute control over my assets. At the time, I thought I was being cautious, protecting what I'd built. Now I realized I'd been prophetic, as if a part of me already knew that one day I'd need this protection, this complete autonomy. That old decision was about to prove the wisest of my life. And what about the documentation of the treatment you mentioned in our conversations? Robert asked, picking up a notepad. I opened my purse and took out a notebook I'd kept hidden for the past few years. Dates, times, detailed descriptions of conversations, names of witnesses who were present in each humiliating situation, screenshots of unanswered messages, records of calls that fell into the void, photos of events I'd been excluded from that I'd found on social media. Everything was there, organized chronologically, meticulous evidence of neglect and systematic contempt. Robert flipped through the notebook in silence, and I saw his expression becoming increasingly serious. "This is very thorough," he finally said. "You really documented everything." Then we got to the most important part of the meeting, financial planning for the future. Robert had asked me to think about what I really wanted to do with all that wealth, about how I wanted to live the coming years. I explained that I wanted to sell the property where I currently lived, the one Jennifer kept insisting I should sell out of necessity. But I wasn't going to sell because I needed the money. I was going to sell because I wanted a fresh start, a complete change of scenery. I had my eyes on a city in Oregon, a quiet, beautiful place, far from all the painful memories that region carried. Robert wrote everything down, already calculating values, already thinking about the logistics of this transition. This emotional story was taking a concrete direction, leaving behind just passive suffering to become deliberate action. "And what about David?" Robert asked, knowing it was a delicate but necessary question. "What do you plan to do regarding him and the family situation?" I stayed silent for a moment, thinking about how to answer. It wasn't about revenge. It never was. I didn't want to destroy my son, didn't want to harm him financially or in any other way. But I wanted him to know the truth, wanted him to understand the monumental mistake he'd made in treating me that way. "I want him to know who I really am," I finally answered. "I want him and Jennifer to understand they confused appearance with reality, that they judged wrong, that they treated badly someone who never needed their help. But mainly, I want them to understand that dignity isn't measured in dollars." Robert spent the next hour explaining technical details, legal implications, the next steps we needed to take. He talked about taxes, about transfers, about documentation that needed updating. But the most important thing was when he looked me in the eyes and said, "You have every right to do this, to live your life as you see fit, to distance yourself from those who don't value you, and you have the resources to do it with complete independence." Those words gave me a strength I hadn't felt in a long time. Yes, I had resources, had autonomy, had choices. I wasn't the helpless elderly mother my ungrateful son and gold-digger daughter-in-law imagined. I was an independent woman, financially stable, who had built everything alone and didn't owe explanations to anyone. Before leaving the office, Robert mentioned something that made me stop at the door. "Just one more thing. In recent months, I received 2 strange phone calls. Someone asking about your assets, about properties, if you had debts." My heart raced. "Who?" He shook his head. They didn't identify themselves properly either time, but from the voice it seemed to be a young woman. "Obviously, I didn't give any information, but I thought you should know someone's trying to investigate your financial situation." I didn't need to think much to know who it was. Jennifer was snooping, trying to find out exactly how much I had or didn't have. That explained some strange questions she'd asked on recent visits, some apparently casual comments about banks and investments. She was looking for something, trying to confirm her suspicions that I was poor. Little did she know what she was going to discover. I left Robert's office with a clarity I hadn't had in years. Everything was falling into place, each piece of the puzzle finding its spot. I had the resources, had the documentation, had the planning, had legal support. Now it was just a matter of time until the truth came out. I drove back home thinking about what that moment would be like, imagining the expressions on their faces when they found out. Would David realize the ungrateful son he'd become? Would Jennifer understand she'd chosen the wrong target for her contempt? Or was it already too late, the damage done irreversibly? Honestly, at that moment, I didn't know. But one thing was certain. They were going to find out the truth. And when that happened, there'd be no way to undo the consequences of the choices they'd made. That night, sitting in my modest living room, I opened the safe and looked at all those documents that represented decades of work. Each bank statement was a memory of sacrifices made, of overtime worked, of smart decisions taken. I'd started from zero, without inheritance, without help, just with determination and discipline. I'd built all of that with my own hands, with my own intelligence, with my own persistence. And now, ironically, all that financial success I'd kept hidden was about to become the most important revelation of my life. Not because the money mattered in itself, but because it would expose the truth about the character of the people around me. And that truth, however painful, needed to come to light. I closed the safe and went back to my favorite armchair, the one where I'd spent so many nights thinking, planning, suffering. But this time, the suffering had given way to something different. Purpose. I knew what I needed to do in the coming days and weeks. I had meetings to schedule, documents to organize, decisions to finalize, and at some point, not too distant, I'd have a conversation with my son that would change everything forever. He thought he knew his mother, thought he knew who I was and what I was worth, but he was about to discover he knew nothing, absolutely nothing. And this discovery would come in a way he'd never forget. The plan was in motion, and there was no turning back. You know when you feel something's wrong even before understanding exactly what. That's how it was that Thursday afternoon when I received an unexpected call from Jennifer. She never called me, always left that task to David on the rare occasions they thought it necessary to contact me. But there she was, with that falsely sweet voice, saying she needed to talk to me about something important and asking if she could stop by my house. My first instinct was to be suspicious, but I agreed. After all, part of me was curious to see how far this story would go, how far a gold-digger daughter-in-law would be capable of going. I scheduled it for the next day, Friday afternoon, and spent the whole night trying to imagine what she wanted. None of the possibilities that went through my head were good. She arrived punctually at 3 p.m, driving that imported car David had bought her for her birthday last year. She wore designer clothes, an expensive purse hanging on her arm, that appearance of someone who has money and makes a point of showing it. The contrast with my simple house, my old furniture, and my modest clothes couldn't be greater. I saw in her look that poorly disguised satisfaction, that feeling of superiority from someone who thinks they're in a better position than the other person. I invited her in, offered tea, which she refused with a dismissive gesture. "I won't take long," she said, opening her expensive purse and taking out a folder full of papers. "I brought some important documents I need you to sign." My heart raced, but I kept a neutral expression, that mask of confused elderly mother I'd perfected over the years. Documents? What kind of documents? Jennifer sat on the couch without being invited and spread the papers on the coffee table, as if she were doing a huge favor. "Look, David and I have been talking a lot about your situation. We worry about you, you know? Living alone in this big house, without many resources, having to manage." Each word was pronounced with that tone of false concern that was already so familiar to me. "So we researched and found these social assistance forms. They're government programs that can help you a lot. Food, medicine, even help with house bills. You just need to sign here, here, and here." She pointed to several lines throughout the documents, marked with yellow post-its. I picked up the papers carefully, pretending to examine them with that expression of someone who doesn't understand much about bureaucracy. But my trained eyes, accustomed to reading contracts and financial documents, immediately caught something wrong. Those weren't simple social assistance forms. There were clauses about power of attorney, about authorization for asset management, about permission for making financial decisions in my name. "This looks complicated," I said, continuing to flip through. "I don't know if I understand everything that's written here." Jennifer leaned forward, and for the first time, I saw a flash of impatience cross that perfectly made-up face. "That's exactly why you need to sign, because these things are too complicated for you to handle alone. We'll take care of everything. You don't need to worry about anything." "We means you and David?" I asked, still holding the papers, still pretending confusion. "Exactly. We'll manage everything for you. Make sure you get all the benefits, that your bills are paid. It'll be much easier this way." She took an expensive pen from her purse and held it out to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "So just sign here in the places I marked. I need to take this today to file it first thing tomorrow morning." The pressure was obvious, the hurry was suspicious, and every instinct inside me screamed that this was a trap. But instead of signing or refusing directly, I did something she didn't expect. "You know, I think I'd better show this to someone who understands these things. I have a friend who worked with legal documents. He can explain it better to me." The change in Jennifer's expression was instantaneous. The fake smile disappeared, replaced by poorly contained irritation. "You don't need to show it to anyone. They're just standard government forms. You're complicating something very simple." But I'd already decided. Even so, I prefer to be sure. They're important documents, it seems. I'll keep them here, and next week I'll give you an answer. I tried to return the pen, but she didn't take it, just looked at me with an expression that mixed frustration and something else, something that seemed almost like fear. "You're being difficult on purpose," she said, and at that moment the mask of concern fell completely. "We're trying to help, and you're creating problems." The tone was no longer sweet. It was acidic, accusatory. I realized I'd touched something sensitive, that my resistance wasn't in her plans. She tried a few more times to convince me to sign right there using different tactics. First, she tried guilt. "David's going to be so disappointed. He really wanted to solve this for you." Then she tried fear. "These programs have limited spots. If you don't sign soon, you might lose the opportunity." And finally, veiled, the threat. "It would be a shame if you ended up needing more serious help in the future and didn't have anyone willing to give it." But I stood firm, repeating that I needed time to analyze, that I wasn't going to sign anything without understanding completely. I saw the frustration growing on her face, her hands squeezing the expensive purse tightly, her lips becoming thin in a line of contained rage. Finally, she gathered the papers brusquely and stood up. "Very well, but don't say we didn't offer help when you need it." And she left, slamming the door hard. As soon as I heard her car leave, I picked up the phone and called Robert. I quickly explained what had happened and said I was sending photos of the documents by email. I need to know exactly what was written there. He promised to analyze immediately and get back to me. While I waited, I looked again at the papers Jennifer had left on the table in her rush to leave. There was a document she'd forgotten to collect, half hidden under the folder. I picked it up and read with growing attention. It was a type of broad power of attorney that, if I'd signed, would give them almost total control over my finances and decisions. My blood ran cold. That wasn't a request for help. It was an attempt to take control of my life, to transform me into someone incapable of managing their own affairs. It was, in essence, an attempt to rob me, even though they thought I had nothing. This emotional story had just taken an even darker turn. Robert called me back in less than an hour, and his voice was serious, almost grave. "Where did you get these documents?" I explained about Jennifer's visit, about the pressure to sign quickly. He sighed deeply on the other end of the line. "Well, I have good news and bad news. The good news is, you didn't sign anything. The bad news is that if you had signed, they would have obtained legal control over any assets you possess. There are clauses here that are extremely comprehensive, allowing decision-making about property sales, access to bank accounts, even commitment to nursing homes if they deemed it necessary. This is very, very serious." I felt my stomach turn. They'd planned this, had researched, had prepared legal documents with the clear intention of assuming control over what they thought were the few belongings of a vulnerable elderly mother. "What do I do now?" I asked, feeling for the first time in this whole story a pang of real concern. Robert thought for a moment before responding. First, you keep those documents very safe. They're evidence of attempted coercion, possibly even elder exploitation, depending on how a judge would interpret it. Second, I think it's time for you to seriously consider revealing your true financial situation, not as a threat, but as protection. As long as they think you're vulnerable, they might try something like this again, maybe even more aggressively. He was right. The experiment had gone too far, had reached a dangerous point. It was no longer just about contempt or lack of respect. It was about a concrete attempt to control my life, based on the false premise that I was an elderly mother without resources and without the ability to defend myself. I hung up the phone and sat in my armchair for hours, processing all of that. My ungrateful son had married a woman who was actively trying to take control of his mother-in-law's life, and he was either aware of this or was complicit through omission. Either way, the line had been crossed. There was no more pretending this was just a misunderstanding, just a matter of different personalities, just a difficult period in family relations. This was serious, had legal implications, had potential for real damage. And while I sat there, in that simple room, wearing my modest clothes, surrounded by the appearance of poverty I myself had created, I made a definitive decision. It was time to end that farce. It was time to show who I really was, with all the consequences that might bring. I picked up my cell phone and sent a message to David. Short, direct. We need to talk. You, me, and Jennifer. Tomorrow, 7 p.m. at my house. It's important. I didn't wait for a response, just turned off the phone and started preparing. I called Robert and asked him to be present, along with my accountant, Michael Torres, who'd managed my investments for years. They needed to be there, not just as witnesses, but as confirmation of the truth I was about to reveal. I spent the night organizing documents, preparing everything I'd need for that conversation. I barely slept, adrenaline and anxiety keeping me awake. But for the first time in a long time, it wasn't anxiety from fear or sadness. It was the anxiety of someone who's about to do something definitive, something that will change everything forever. And I was ready. More than ready. The silence before the storm is real, and I felt every second of it that Saturday afternoon while I prepared my house for the most important meeting of my life. I arranged the living room differently, putting in extra chairs, organizing the coffee table to accommodate all the documents I'd need to present. Robert arrived first, at 6:30, followed by Michael a few minutes later. They brought folders, laptops, everything we needed for that revelation. "Are you sure about this?" Robert asked, putting his hand on my shoulder with genuine concern. "There's no going back after you do this." I looked at him and nodded. "I know, and I'm ready. More than that, they need to know. For what they tried to do yesterday, for the systematic disrespect, for everything, they need to understand who they were really despising." Exactly at 7 o'clock at night, I heard a car park outside. My heart raced, but I kept my breathing controlled. It was time. David and Jennifer entered with confused expressions, seeing Robert and Michael sitting in the living room. "Mom, what's going on here? Who are these people?" David asked, looking around with growing discomfort. Jennifer was more reticent, her eyes narrowing as she noticed the documents spread out on the table. I asked them to sit down, and there was a moment of hesitation before they obeyed. "David, Jennifer, I want you to meet Robert Mitchell, my lawyer for 15 years, and Michael Torres, my accountant and investment manager." I saw Jennifer's jaw drop slightly, but she recovered quickly, that arrogant expression returning to her face. "Lawyer? Accountant? Mom, you can't spend money on these things. You barely have resources to maintain yourself." It was at that moment Robert intervened, his voice professional and firm. "Actually, that's exactly why we're here. About resources, or the lack thereof, or rather, about the mistaken impression you have about her financial situation." I started slowly, controlling every word, every emotion. 10 years ago, I made a decision. I decided to change my appearance, my lifestyle, the way I presented myself to the world. Not because I needed to, not because I'd lost money or gone through difficulties, but because I wanted to discover something very important: how people would treat me if they thought I had nothing to offer. I saw David frown, confused, while Jennifer remained tense, her fingers squeezing the purse in her lap. I put away my expensive clothes, stopped mentioning my businesses, started complaining about bills and talking about economizing. And then I observed how the treatment changed, how respect diminished, how the love they said they felt for me started to seem increasingly conditional, especially after you got married, David, especially after Jennifer joined this family. Michael opened his laptop and turned the screen so they could see. These are your mother's bank statements from the last 5 years. The screen showed numbers that made Jennifer visibly pale. As you can see, she maintains 3 checking accounts at different institutions, all with significant balances. The main account currently has, he paused for effect, $423,000. The silence that followed was absolute. I saw my son swallow hard, eyes wide, unable to process that information. Jennifer seemed to have forgotten how to breathe, but I wasn't finished. Continue, Michael. He moved to the next screen. Investment funds, stocks, government bonds. The total investment portfolio is currently valued at $1,200,000, with annual returns ranging between 7 and 9%, depending on the market. This can't be right. Jennifer finally found her voice, but it came out trembling, full of disbelief. You don't have money. Your clothes, your house, the way you live. Robert took another folder and distributed copies of documents to each of them. Deeds. 3 properties, all paid off and registered exclusively in her name. This house where we are now, valued at $350,000. An apartment in Seattle, rented for $2,500 monthly. And a beach house in Southern California, rented for $3,800 monthly. Passive monthly income from rentals alone, $6,300, approximately. I observed their expressions changing, from disbelief to shock, from shock to something that seemed like shame mixed with anger. This emotional story was finally reaching its climax, and I needed all my strength not to break down right there. David finally managed to speak, his voice coming out hoarse, almost inaudible. Mom, I don't understand. Why did you do this? Why did you lie to us? And that's when I felt emotion tighten my throat, but I forced myself to continue. I never lied, David. I never said I was poor, never asked for help, never claimed not to have resources. I just stopped displaying what I had. And you know what I discovered? That when people think you have nothing, they show who they really are. And you, my son, you showed me that I was worth less in your eyes because I seemed to have less. That my value as a mother, as a person, was directly linked to the perception of my financial status. I picked up my notebook, the one where I'd written everything down for years. Every cruel comment from Jennifer, every silence of yours when she humiliated me, every event I was excluded from, every unanswered message, every contempt, every total humiliation. It's all here, documented, with dates, times, witnesses. Jennifer stood up abruptly, her face red, a mixture of rage and panic. You deceived us. You stayed there pretending to be poor just to make us look bad. What kind of person does that? Her voice was loud, almost shouting, and for the first time I saw her mask of superiority completely destroyed. But I kept my voice calm, firm. The kind of person who wants to know if she's loved for who she is or for what she has. The kind of mother who needs to discover if the son she raised still has character when he thinks she can't offer anything. And you know what the answer was, Jennifer? You failed, completely. You treated an elderly mother, or what you thought was a poor elderly mother, with contempt, cruelty, and, in your case specifically, with clear intent to exploit. I picked up the documents she'd brought the day before and threw them on the table. These papers you tried to get me to sign yesterday? My lawyer analyzed them. Broad power of attorney, asset control, authorization for institutionalization. You were trying to take control of the life of someone you thought was vulnerable. David had his head in his hands, and when he lifted his face, I saw tears falling. Mom, I didn't know about the documents. Jennifer didn't tell me she was going to do that. But I shook my head, tired. But you knew about everything else, David. You were present at every dinner where I was humiliated, at every meeting where I was silenced, at every event I was excluded from. You saw your wife treat me like garbage and said nothing. You became an ungrateful son who valued the opinion of a gold-digger daughter-in-law more than your own mother's dignity. That's the son you became. And it wasn't Jennifer who did that to you. It was your own choices. The words came out harsh but true, and I saw each one hit my son like physical blows. Part of me wanted to comfort him, hug him like I did when he was a child. But the bigger part, the part hurt by years of rejection, knew he needed to hear that. Jennifer tried one last card, that manipulative look she'd probably used many times successfully. Look, maybe we were a bit harsh, but you have to understand our side too. You seemed to need help. We were just trying to… Robert interrupted her with a firm gesture. No, you're not going to do that here. You're not going to try to reverse the situation or make her feel guilty for exposing the truth. The documents are here, the numbers don't lie, and the chronology of events she kept is extremely detailed. If this went to court, and considering the attempt to obtain power of attorney under false pretenses, you'd have serious legal problems. Jennifer's face lost all color, and she let herself fall back into the chair, defeated. David kept looking at me, that look of someone who finally understands the magnitude of the mistake they made, but understands too late. I took a deep breath before continuing, knowing that what I was going to say next would define the future of all our relationships. I didn't do this for revenge. I did it out of necessity to know the truth. And now that I know, now that we all know, I need to make decisions about my future. I've decided to sell this house. I'm moving to Oregon, to a quiet town where you don't know me, where I can start over without the weight of all these painful memories. I'm going to live my life, with my resources, the way I choose. And as for you, I paused, feeling the weight of that moment. You're going to need to decide who you want to be from here on out. If you want to try to fix this, if you want to seek some kind of redemption, or if you prefer to continue being the people you've revealed yourselves to be in these past years. Michael and Robert started collecting the documents, the meeting clearly coming to an end. You can go now. Think about what you saw here, what you heard. When and if you're ready for an honest conversation, you know where to find me. For now, they stood up slowly, as if in a trance. David tried to say something, opened his mouth several times, but the words wouldn't come out. Jennifer was pale, defeated in a way I'd never seen. They walked to the door in silence, and only when they were leaving did David turn one last time. Mom, But I raised my hand, stopping his words. Not today, David. Not now. You need to process all this, and I need time too. Just think about who you want to be. If you want to be the man I raised, or the man you've become. They left, and I heard the car leaving in the cold night. I closed the door and leaned against it for a long moment, feeling the weight of years of secrecy finally being released. Robert and Michael approached, concerned. Are you okay? Robert asked. I looked at them, and for the first time in a long time, I smiled genuinely. I am. For the first time in years, I'm really okay. The truth is exposed, and now we can move forward, whatever that means. The days following the big revelation were strange, almost surreal. I woke up Sunday morning and for a few seconds forgot what had happened the night before. But then everything came back at once. The shocked expressions on their faces, the numbers on the laptop screen, the heavy silence that had filled my living room. I lay there longer than usual, processing, feeling something I couldn't completely name. It wasn't exactly relief, although there was a bit of that. It wasn't happiness, definitely not. It was more like liberation, as if I'd been carrying an enormous weight for years and finally had permission to put it down. I got up, made my breakfast, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel that tightness in my chest when thinking about my family. I'd done what needed to be done, and now it was time to move forward. My phone stayed silent all Sunday, without any call or message from David or Jennifer. Part of me expected some kind of immediate reaction, maybe anger, maybe desperation, maybe frantic attempts at reconciliation. But there was nothing. Monday passed, then Tuesday, and the silence continued. It wasn't the silence of contempt I'd experienced in recent years, the one that made me feel invisible. This was different. It was the silence of someone processing, of someone caught completely off guard who needs time to understand what happened. I used that time productively, calling the real estate agency to put my house up for sale, researching properties in Oregon, starting to organize decades of life into boxes. This emotional story was entering a new phase, a phase where I finally had complete control over my narrative. On Wednesday night, almost a week after the meeting, David finally called. My heart raced when I saw his name on the screen, but I took a deep breath before answering. Hello? There was a long pause on the other end, and then his voice, tired, defeated. "Mom, can we talk? Just the two of us, without Jennifer, without lawyers, just you and me?" I considered for a moment. Part of me was still hurt, still felt the pain of years of rejection. But another part, the part that was still a mother, wanted to give him this chance. "You can come tomorrow afternoon, 3 o'clock. He agreed quickly, thanked me, and hung up. I spent the whole night thinking about what I'd say, about how I'd establish the boundaries that needed to be established, about how I'd make it clear that things would never be the same again, because they wouldn't be. They couldn't be. David arrived at the scheduled time, and the change in him was visible. He looked older, more tired, shoulders curved as if carrying a weight. I offered coffee, which he accepted gratefully, and we sat in uncomfortable silence for a few minutes before he finally started talking. "Mom, I spent the whole week trying to understand how I let things get to this point, how I became the person you described at that meeting. And the truth is, you were right about everything." His voice broke a little, and I saw tears beginning to form in his eyes. "I became an ungrateful son. I let Jennifer dictate how you should be treated, agreed with cruel comments, excluded you because I was ashamed of your appearance, of what people would think. And worse, I tried to justify all of this by telling myself I was moving up in life, that I was evolving. But the only thing I did was forget where I came from and who helped me get where I am. I listened to everything without interrupting, letting him vent, letting him get out years of wrong choices and repressed guilt. But when he finished, when he looked at me expecting some kind of immediate absolution, I kept my voice firm and clear. "David, I accept that you recognize your mistakes. That's important. It's the first step. But you need to understand something. Recognizing isn't the same as fixing. Apologizing doesn't erase years of humiliation, of contempt, of making me feel like I had no value at all. And especially, it doesn't change the fact that you chose, repeatedly, your wife and your social comfort over your own mother's dignity." I saw the impact of my words on his face, but I continued. "I didn't do that experiment for revenge. I did it out of necessity for truth. But now that the truth is exposed, I can't just pretend nothing happened." He nodded slowly, wiping tears with the back of his hand. "I understand. And I'm not asking you to forget, or forgive immediately, or pretend everything's okay. I'm just asking for a chance to show I can be different, that I can go back to being the son you deserve." It was a sincere request. I could see it in his eyes, in the way his hands trembled holding the coffee cup. But sincerity wasn't enough, not after everything. "David, if you really want a chance to rebuild this, it'll have to be my way, in my time, on my terms. And the first term is this: Jennifer needs to acknowledge what she did too. Not just the documents incident, but years of cruel treatment, of derogatory comments, of actively trying to isolate and humiliate me. If you two can't do this together, then there's no possible reconstruction." His expression became even heavier, and I realized this was the most difficult point. "She's going through a difficult time. When the documents she tried to get you to sign were exposed, she panicked. She's afraid of legal consequences, that you might sue her, that this will destroy her reputation." I felt a pang of bitter satisfaction hearing this, but kept my expression neutral. "And she should be. What she tried to do was serious, possibly criminal. But I'm not interested in suing her, David. I don't want to destroy her life legally. What I want is simple, honest acknowledgement of what was done, and a genuine commitment to change. If she can't offer that, then you both need to understand that the relationship between us will be, at best, distant and formal. I'm not going to put myself in a position to be humiliated or disrespected anymore. Those days are over." We spent the next hour talking, establishing clear boundaries. I explained I was selling the house and moving, that this decision wasn't negotiable and had nothing to do with punishment, but with my need for a fresh start. I made it clear I didn't expect financial help from them, never expected it and never would, but that I also wouldn't be treated anymore as if I needed it. I established that any future contact would be on my schedule, on my conditions, and that I had every right to refuse visits or calls if I didn't feel respected. David agreed to everything, promised to talk seriously with Jennifer, promised to try to rebuild something real instead of the broken facade our family relationship had become. When he left, he hugged me tight, whispering once more, "Sorry, Mom," before leaving. I closed the door and leaned against it, exhausted, but also strangely at peace. In the following days, I started receiving messages. First, from Jennifer. Long messages apologizing, explaining she'd let herself be carried away by greed, by insecurity, by fear that David would go back to being poor, like he'd been in childhood. She admitted she'd grown up in a family where money was everything, where personal worth was measured in bank accounts, and that she'd projected these insecurities onto me. They were elaborate messages, clearly thought through carefully, and although there was sincerity there was also that tone of someone trying to avoid consequences. I only responded, "I read your messages. I'll need time to process. When and if I'm ready to talk, I'll let you know." It wasn't forgiveness, but it also wasn't complete rejection. It was just honesty, something that had been missing in our relationship from the start. The house was put up for sale and quickly attracted interested buyers. The real estate market was hot, and a well-maintained property like mine was desirable. While dealing with visits from potential buyers, I was also keeping an eye on properties in Oregon, specifically in a small coastal town called Cannon Beach. I'd found a beautiful house, smaller than the current one, but perfectly adequate for my needs, with an ocean view and that kind of tranquility I craved. I talked with Robert about the move, about legal aspects, about ensuring everything was in order. "Are you sure about this?" he asked once more. "Moving to another state, starting over in a new place, far from family?" I looked at him and smiled. "Robert, for the first time in a decade, I'm absolutely certain about something. I need this fresh start, away from all these memories, away from the person I became here. In Oregon, I can be simply me, without the weight of all this past." News of my move reached other family members, and I started receiving calls from cousins, aunts, people who hadn't spoken to me in years, but who were suddenly concerned about this decision. It was fascinating how the revelation of my financial situation had changed everything. How people who ignored me when they thought I was a poor elderly mother now wanted to keep in touch, offered help, suggested visits. But I'd learned my lesson about who to value. I was polite but firm with everyone. I thanked them for their concern, but made it clear I was doing what was best for me, that I didn't need advice or interference. Some were offended, others tried to insist, but I held my ground. I'd spent years being passive, accepting bad treatment, letting others define my worth. Those days were definitively over. David and Jennifer asked to make one last visit before my move, and after considering carefully, I agreed. They arrived on a Saturday afternoon, bringing flowers and a handwritten letter Jennifer had prepared. We sat in the already partially emptied living room, boxes stacked against the walls, and talked for hours. They acknowledged the mistakes in specific details, not just generic apologies, but real acknowledgement of each incident, each cruel comment, each deliberate exclusion. Jennifer cried several times, and this time the tears seemed genuine, not manipulative. David held my hand and told me things I'd waited years to hear. But even with all that, even with the acknowledgement and apologies, I knew the relationship would never be the same, and I was at peace with that, because dignity, once recovered, isn't negotiated anymore, and I had recovered mine. Have you ever noticed how apologies arrive when people finally understand what they've lost? That's exactly how it was in the weeks leading up to my move. Messages started arriving more frequently, not just from David and Jennifer, but from other relatives too. Cousins who'd ignored me at gatherings, aunts who'd made mean comments about my clothes, even some old friends who distanced themselves when my appearance changed. Everyone suddenly wanted to express regret. Everyone wanted a chance to explain their behavior. Everyone had their justifications ready. It was fascinating in a sad way how the revelation of my true financial situation had transformed their perception of who I was. I was still the same person, but now, in their eyes, I was worth trying to win back. This emotional story was revealing layers of hypocrisy I didn't even imagine existed. One by one, they came to me. It started with my cousin Diane, who hadn't talked to me properly in at least 3 years. She showed up one day at my door with a homemade cake, that nervous smile on her face. "I heard you're moving and thought I'd visit before it's too late." I invited her in, more out of politeness than real desire, and we sat in the kitchen while she tried to find the right words. "Look, I know I wasn't the best cousin in recent years. When you started to, well, when it seemed things weren't going well financially for you, I kind of distanced myself. And now Knowing the truth, I feel terrible. She stirred her coffee cup, avoiding my gaze. I could have made it easy for her, could have said everything was okay, that there was no problem, but I wasn't going to do that. Not anymore. Diane, you distanced yourself because you thought I no longer had social value, because at family gatherings, you preferred to stay near successful people, those who had interesting stories to tell about trips and expensive purchases. I became an embarrassment, someone who reminded everyone our family had humble origins. My words were harsh but true, and I saw her face turn red. It wasn't quite like that. She tried to protest, but I raised my hand. It was exactly like that. And you know what hurts most? It's not even the fact that you distanced yourself. It's the fact that you're only here now because you found out I had money all along. If I really were that poor elderly mother you thought I was, would you have come to make this visit? Would you have brought this cake? Her silence was answer enough. She left shortly after, and I never heard from her again. Jennifer's apologies were the most elaborate, perhaps because she had the most to lose. She started coming alone, without David, bringing small gifts, trying to establish some kind of direct connection with me. On one of these visits, she brought old photo albums showing the difficult childhood she'd had, the domineering mother who valued only appearances and social status. I know this doesn't justify what I did, she said, flipping through the photos with trembling fingers. But I want you to understand where my behavior came from. I grew up thinking personal worth and financial worth were the same thing, that people without money were people without merit. That's how my family raised me, and I never questioned it until now. Her words were sincere, I could see that, but sincerity didn't erase years of deliberate cruelty. Jennifer, I understand childhood traumas. I understand how upbringing shapes who we are. But at some point, you became an adult, and adults make conscious choices about how to treat other people. She nodded, wiping tears that were now falling freely. I know, and the choices I made were horrible. I treated you as if you were less than human, as if your existence were a nuisance. And those documents, her voice failed. I convinced myself I was doing something good, that I was helping you have a more organized life. But the truth is, I wanted control. I wanted to make sure you'd never be a financial burden to us. And in my twisted mind, I thought getting power of attorney over your few belongings would be a solution. When I see now what I was really doing, trying to steal control of a perfectly capable woman's life, I feel absolutely disgusted with myself. It was the most honest acknowledgement she'd made so far, but even so, it didn't change the essential. The actions had been taken, the damage had been done, and acknowledging it now didn't erase the pain it had caused. David also continued his reconciliation attempts, but in a different way. He didn't try to justify his behavior with traumas or upbringing. He simply took complete responsibility. Mom, I failed you in every possible way. I let my marriage transform me into someone you didn't raise, into someone who valued others' opinions more than his own mother's dignity. And the hardest part to accept is that nobody forced me to do this. It was my choices, my cowardice, my ridiculous shame of having come from humble origins. He said this during one of his visits, sitting in that same room where he'd been exposed to the truth weeks before. I'm not asking for immediate forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I'm just asking that you don't give up on me completely, that you leave a door open, even if small, for me to prove I can go back to being the son you deserve. I heard all the apologies, all the requests for forgiveness, all the acknowledgments of error with the same posture, present, attentive, but emotionally protected, because I'd learned something valuable during those years of experimenting. Apologies are just words if they don't come accompanied by real behavioral change, and real change takes time, consistency, proof through actions, and not just promises. David, Jennifer, all of you, I said at a final meeting I organized before the move, with all the family members who'd reached out to me. I accept your apologies. I recognize there's sincerity in many of them. I recognize some of you really understand the gravity of what you did. But accepting apologies isn't the same as forgetting what happened, and it's definitely not the same as immediately trusting again. I saw some faces fall, some disappointed looks, but I continued. Respect isn't something you ask for after being ignored for so long. Respect is built, maintained, demonstrated through consistent actions. I then explained how things would be from there on. I was moving, and this decision was final, not open for discussion or persuasion. I'd keep in touch with whomever I chose to keep in touch with, but it would always be on my terms, on my availability, when I felt comfortable. I wouldn't accept surprise visits anymore, comments about my life choices, or any form of treatment that made me feel devalued. If you want to be part of my life from here on out, it'll be by respecting these conditions. And if at any moment I feel respect isn't being maintained, I'll simply distance myself without explanations or drama. My days of accepting crumbs of affection are over. Some agreed readily. Others seemed to resist internally, but nodded anyway. But everyone understood the message. The rules had changed, and whoever couldn't adapt would be left behind. There was a particularly touching moment when an older Aunt Margaret, who'd always been relatively kind to me even during my poverty phase, approached after the meeting. "You know I never treated you differently, right? Even when others distanced themselves, I kept calling, kept inviting you to things." It was true, Aunt Margaret had been one of the few who maintained consistent treatment. "I know, Aunt, and I appreciate that. You showed me not everyone measured my worth by my apparent financial status." She held my hands, squeezing affectionately. "So why are you distancing yourself from everyone? I understand wanting distance from those who hurt you, but why from me too?" I sighed, trying to find the right words. "Because even the good memories are contaminated by the bad ones now. Every family gathering, every holiday, every event reminds me of how I was treated by most people. And I need a clean space, without these constant triggers, to heal completely." She seemed to understand, although she was visibly sad. "But you'll keep in touch, right? Calls, video chats, maybe occasional visits?" I promised yes, that I'd maintain a relationship with her, because she'd proven genuine when so many others weren't. And I kept that promise. Even after the move, Aunt Margaret and I maintained regular contact, and she was one of the few who truly deserved a place in my new life. With David and Jennifer, I established a different pattern. Monthly conversations via video chat, always initiated by me, always on my availability. They accepted these conditions without question, understanding it was the most I could offer at the moment. And maybe, with time and consistency of behavior from them, this could expand. But it would be at my pace, not theirs. The week before the move was emotionally exhausting. Final goodbyes, last visits, last chances to see places that had been part of my life for so long. But there was also growing excitement, an anticipation of the new, of the unknown, of a life where I could be simply me without all the weight of the past. On the last night in the house, after everything was packed and the move was scheduled for the next morning, I sat in the empty living room, just me and my memories. I thought about everything that had happened, about how a decision made 10 years ago had revealed such deep and painful truths. I thought about the ungrateful son David had become and the belated apologies he now offered. I thought about the gold-digger daughter-in-law Jennifer was and the shame she now carried. And I thought about myself, about the elderly mother everyone thought I was, but who was actually a strong, independent woman capable of completely rebuilding her life. As I looked at that empty room for the last time, I realized something important. The apologies had arrived, the acknowledgments had been made, the requests for forgiveness had been expressed, but none of that, absolutely nothing, erased the past. What had been done was done. The cruel words had been said, the total humiliations had happened, the years of contempt had been lived. Apologies didn't have the power to go back in time and undo these experiences. What they could do, at best, was open a door to a different future, to the possibility of reconstruction. But rebuilding meant starting from zero, not resuming from where we stopped. And I was ready for that, ready to give that chance, but on my terms, in my way, protecting above all the dignity I'd fought so hard to recover. Tomorrow would begin a new chapter, literally and figuratively, and I was more ready than ever. The trip to Oregon was liberating in a way I didn't expect. As I drove down the highway, watching the landscape gradually change, I felt as if each mile distanced me, not just geographically, but emotionally from everything I'd left behind. The moving truck had left the morning before, taking all my things, and I'd chosen to make the trip alone, at my own pace, stopping when I wanted, appreciating the journey as much as the destination. There was no rush, no commitments, no one waiting for me with expectations or judgments. For the first time in a decade, I was simply me, without needing to pretend anything, without carrying the weight of an elaborate performance. and this feeling was better than any amount in a bank account could provide. It was pure freedom, conquered through pain, but finally achieved. I arrived in Cannon Beach in the late afternoon on a Saturday, and the sight of the ocean took my breath away. I'd seen photos, of course, had done virtual video calls with the real estate agency, but nothing compared to being there in person. The house was on a quiet street, just a few blocks from the beach, with that characteristic architecture of the northwest coast. Wood, large windows, wide porches. It was smaller than my previous house, but perfect for my needs. The moving truck had already arrived, and the furniture was being unloaded when I parked. I stood still for a moment, just looking, processing that this was real, that I'd really done this. I'd left behind an entire life, a complicated family, painful memories, and had started completely anew. At 72 years old, I was starting over, and there was nothing sad about that. It was courageous, it was necessary, it was exactly what I needed. The first days in the new house were about organization and discovery, unpacking boxes, deciding where everything went, meeting neighbors who proved surprisingly welcoming. A lady named Patricia, who lived in the house next door, showed up on the second day with homemade cookies and a genuine smile. "Welcome to the neighborhood. My husband and I have lived here for 15 years, and we love it. You'll see it's a very quiet community." We talked on the porch for almost an hour, and she told me about local events, the best restaurants, where to shop, all without asking a single invasive question about my past or my financial situation. It was refreshing, it was normal, it was exactly the kind of simple human interaction I'd lost somewhere along the years. Here, I was just the new resident, the nice lady who'd moved from California. Nothing more, nothing less. I established a new routine quickly. I'd wake up early to walk on the beach, something I'd never been able to do regularly before. The sound of the waves, the fresh sea air, the feeling of sand under my feet, all of this became a daily meditation, a moment of connection with myself that I didn't know I needed. Then I'd go back home, have breakfast on the porch while reading or just watching the birds. Afternoons were for exploring the town, getting to know local shops, talking with other residents. And evenings were mine, completely mine, to do whatever I wanted, watch movies, read books, cook new recipes, or simply sit in silence appreciating the peace. There were no unwanted phone calls, no visits that made me uncomfortable, no constant tension of always being on the defensive. For the first time in years, I breathed freely. David called once a week, always respecting the time we'd agreed on. The conversations were careful, him clearly walking on eggshells, trying to rebuild something without pushing too much. We talked about small things, about how my adaptation to the new city was going, about the weather, about little things from his daily life. Never about Jennifer, unless I asked. Never about money or inheritance. Subjects he'd learned the hard way were forbidden. In one of these calls, about 2 months after the move, he said something that surprised me. "Mom, I started therapy, both Jennifer and I, individual and couples therapy. We want to work on the problems that led to all of that, understand where that behavior came from, ensure it never happens again." I stayed silent for a moment, processing. "That's good, David. Very good. It shows you're taking this seriously." And it was true. Words were easy, but actions, concrete changes, that meant something real. As the months passed, Cannon Beach became not just a place where I lived, but a true home. I made genuine friendships, not based on family history or social obligations, but on real connections. I joined a book club at the local library, where I met fascinating women with incredible stories. I started doing volunteer work at an animal shelter, something I'd always wanted to do but never had time for. I discovered a small art gallery where I eventually started exhibiting some paintings I'd made, a hobby I'd abandoned decades ago. The life I was building there had nothing to do with money or status. It was about purpose, about contribution, about doing things that brought me genuine joy. And for the first time, I understood the difference between existing and living. I'd spent so much time just existing, surviving contempt and pain, that I'd forgotten what it was like to really live. One day, about 6 months after the move, I was on the beach during sunset when I had an epiphany. I thought about the entire journey I'd made, from the initial decision to disguise myself as poor to that moment of complete renewal. I thought about how I'd been treated, how I'd suffered, but also how I'd learned fundamental truths about human nature, about values, about what really matters. And I realized something crucial. I'd never been poor, not in the sense that mattered. Real poverty isn't about numbers in a bank account. It's about lack of dignity, lack of self-respect, lack of autonomy. And these things I'd always had, even when I pretended not to have money, even when I was treated as if I were worthless. The real wealth was in my capacity to recognize my own value regardless of what others thought, in the courage to start over when necessary, in the strength to establish boundaries and maintain them. Nobody could take that from me, and that was worth more than any fortune. I started sharing my story, not all the details, but the essence of it, with some of the friends I'd made in Cannon Beach. One afternoon, during the book club meeting, one of the women asked about my family, why I'd moved alone so far away. I normally deflected this type of conversation, but that day I felt I could trust that group. I told them a summarized version, that I'd disguised myself as poor for years to discover if I'd be loved for who I was or for what I had, that the answer had been painful but enlightening, and that I'd decided to start over in a new place where I could be simply me. The silence that followed wasn't judgmental, but of deep understanding. One of the women, Clara, held my hand and said, "You're the bravest person I've ever met." Most of us spend our whole lives afraid of discovering painful truths, so we simply don't look. You looked, faced them, and still had the strength to rebuild. That's extraordinary. Those words touched me deeply, because they represented an acknowledgement I'd never received from my own family. It wasn't about money or possessions, it was about character, about inner strength, about the courage to make difficult choices in search of truth and authenticity. I realized this was the story I wanted to define my life, not the story of an elderly mother humiliated by an ungrateful son and a gold-digger daughter-in-law, but the story of a woman who had the courage to test reality, accept painful truths, and rebuild her life on her own terms. The total humiliation I'd experienced wasn't the end of my story. It was just a chapter, a necessary chapter that had led to something much bigger. It was about transformation, about discovering that dignity doesn't depend on others' approval, and that it's never too late to start over. David and Jennifer asked to visit me when it had been a year since my move. I hesitated initially, didn't know if I was ready to have them in my new space, in the sanctuary I'd built away from all the bad memories. But after talking with Aunt Margaret, who'd become a wise and trustworthy counselor, I decided to give this chance. They arrived on a spring weekend, clearly nervous, clearly respecting every boundary I'd established. The visit was different. They praised my house, my new life, my apparent peace, but there was real respect behind the words, not just superficial politeness. Jennifer, in particular, was visibly changed, more humble, more aware, more genuine. In a moment alone with me on the porch, while David had gone for a walk on the beach, she said something I never expected to hear. "I envied you for so long, in such a distorted way, that I transformed it into cruelty. I envied the fact that you'd raised a son alone and he loved you, while my own mother never truly loved me. And when I thought you were poor, it was easier to despise you than deal with my own inadequacy. This doesn't justify anything, but it's the truth I discovered in therapy." It was a moment of raw honesty that changed something between us. It didn't erase the past, but it opened a real possibility for a different future. We spent the weekend talking for real, not just superficially, about life, choices, regrets, hopes. David told me about how he'd started reconnecting with his origins, with the person he'd been before becoming obsessed with appearances and status. I took them to see my favorite places in town, introduced them to some of my new friends, and felt genuine pride saying, "This is my son David and my daughter-in-law Jennifer." Not because they were rich or successful, but because they were genuinely trying to be better people. When they left on Sunday night, I hugged them more warmly than I'd been able to in years. There was still a long way to go. There were still scars that needed time to heal completely. But for the first time, I felt real hope that the relationship could be rebuilt on solid and true foundations. Sitting on my porch that night, after they left, I reflected on everything that had happened since that horrible Christmas that had marked the beginning of the end of my old life. It had been a journey of pain, revelation, courage, and rebirth. I'd learned that people who confuse value with money end up losing both, because they lose the ability to recognize what really matters. I'd learned that dignity isn't negotiated, no matter who's on the other side of the table. I'd learned it's never too late to start over, to establish boundaries, to choose your own happiness above others' expectations. And most importantly, I'd learned I'd never been poor, not in the true sense. I'd always had wealth where it really mattered, in autonomy, in strength of character, in the ability to make difficult but necessary choices. Money only gave me material security, but these other qualities gave me something much more valuable, the ability to live with dignity, regardless of circumstances or others' opinions. I looked at the ocean, hearing the constant sound of the waves, and smiled. This emotional story had been my life. It had been real, it had been painful, but it had also been transformative. I didn't regret anything, not even the suffering, because everything had led me to this moment of deep and authentic peace. I was Margaret Ann Foster, 72 years old, David's mother, a woman who'd built her own fortune, tested the limits of family loyalty, survived total humiliation, and emerged stronger and more complete than ever. And for the first time in my life, I was living exactly as I wanted, without needing to prove anything to anyone, without carrying the weight of expectations or judgments, simply being myself in all my complexity and truth. And that, I realized in that moment of absolute clarity, was the true wealth. It was the kind of wealth nobody could take away, that no circumstance could diminish, that would remain with me until my last day. And that certainty brought me a peace that no amount of money could ever buy. And so we reach the end of this journey, a true story that began with humiliation and contempt, but ended with recovered dignity and a life rebuilt on my own terms. I learned that a person's true value is never in what they possess, but in who they choose to be when nobody's watching. I learned that true love doesn't change according to bank accounts, and that respect isn't something you ask for after years of being ignored. It's something built through consistent and genuine actions. Today, living in this quiet town by the ocean, I found something money could never buy: inner peace and the freedom to be simply myself. My son and daughter-in-law are trying to rebuild what was broken, and although the path is long, there's hope. Because real change is possible when people are genuinely willing to face their mistakes and work to be better. And you? Have you been through something similar? Have you had to establish difficult boundaries with people you love? Have you felt undervalued by someone who should respect you? What would you do if you were in my place? Share your story in the comments, because sometimes we need these conversations to understand we're not alone in our struggles. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss other emotional stories that bring life lessons and make us reflect on our own choices and relationships. Because at the end of the day, we're all trying to navigate these complicated waters called family, love, and dignity. And together, we can learn from each other. Until the next story.